One of the best speed coaches in our industry is a man named Taft, who I've had the great pleasure to watch at conferences and clinics many times over the years. What I'd like to do today is share with you my 3 top tips from what I've learned from Lee over the many years that I've had the chance to learn from him. So the first is something that I think was a little bit controversial. He even mentioned that in the first clinic, which was something called the plyo step, or what a lot of coaches call a false step. So showing you from the side view, what he was talking about is that coaches traditionally taught running backs, in particular in football, not to take a step backwards as their first move, with the idea that I'm not moving my center of gravity backwards in order to be fast forward. Well, Lee kind of jumped into that discussion and said, no, that's exactly what you're supposed to do, is you're supposed to take a quick step behind you so you get your hips out in front of your step. It's the fastest, most efficient way to move forward. I remember seeing other coaches argue with Lee in these conferences, but he always proved to be right. So the first tip I have for you is to let your athletes, if they need to accelerate forward, don't be afraid to let them take what's traditionally called a false step, but use it to their advantage. So if I'm running forward, as opposed to falling forward and taking a step, don't be afraid, of course it's going to work faster anyways, to take that quick step back, and that will help them to propel forward much more successfully. The second tip that I learned was in change of direction laterally. So Lee talks about changing direction and getting your foot out away from your shoulders, which is a great tip, but a little insider tip that he gave us in a conference a few years ago was talking about how your foot strikes the ground. And most athletes, when they change direction, will hit with the tips of their toes or the top part of their foot, but it's much more efficient and much more effective to drive off the entire inside edge from your toes all the way down to your heel. And as long as my foot is out away from my center of gravity and I'm pushing hard into the ground, having that extra surface area allows me to get more drive off of that cutting step. And my third tip for you is to do something that Lee calls a hip turn. So when an athlete is playing defense, they're guarding somebody in front of them, one of the worst things you can do, it's slow and it causes injuries, is to open up and take a step like this, where I have all my weight on a planted foot while I'm trying to rotate off of that. As you can see right there, my knee buckles in right off the bat, just showing you here. What's much more effective is to use your hips in what Lee calls the hip turn move, where instead of pivoting like that, you just reposition your hips and push. Much quicker, much more effective, and it covers more ground in your first step. So as a defender, if somebody's trying to get by me, if I do this, I only get this far. They have the momentum, they're gonna be right by. But if I take that quick step, if I open up using that hip turn that Lee teaches, I turn and I'm much further with very little effort. So don't worry about the false step. He calls it a plyo step. It's a great advantage for athletes, pushing off the inside edge when I move laterally and using a hip turn to change direction as a defender. 3 great tips from the legendary Taft.